Okay, so we're still in the sugya of Oina, and it's slowing down a little because this is a very complicated piece of Gemara on Daf Nun, Amud Aleph, Amud Beis. We may or may not be able to finish this piece of it today, but the upshot, again, of what we're discussing is, in general, we understand that, oh no, the way we understand it from the Mishnah, at least according to the Rabbanon, has to do with whether or not there was a fraud of a sixth, more, less, exact, but that's the target of what we're discussing. Then we folded in what the Mishnah talks about Rav Tarfon, that Rav Tarfon, where he was, changed the dynamic, and he said it wasn't really a sixth that was the litmus test of fraud, but it was a third. So now the Gemara, and especially last week, we were trying to sort of analyze, how does a third stack up with a sixth? How do the Rabbanan stack up with Rav Tarfon? Are they really saying the same thing, but in different sort of parallel numbers? In other words, a little bit of a different universe, but it's the same halachas for a third as for a sixth or not. And that's where it really started getting complicated, because we went back and forth to try to understand whether what the Rabbanan say is a sixth is really exactly a third according to Rav Tarfon. And again, we can spend a lot of time with this. I'd rather not, because this could take weeks. But so I think for our understanding, it's probably better to ride it a little bit more superficially, but still understand what the Gemara is telling us as far as the halachas. And now, compounded by all of this, and you have to keep this in the back of your mind, is that this Mishnah is not the halacha. The halacha really says something different. This Mishnah departs from the halacha, and since we are discussing all of what we're discussing in the scope of the Mishnah, not of the halacha, that makes it a little bit more complicated, because, as we remember, according to the Mishnah, exactly a shtus can either be reverting. In other words, you can get your differential of the fraud, or the defrauded party can absolutely turn over the deal and void it. If it's over a six, both sides can void it. But if it's exactly a six, our Mishnah says you have a choice. The halacha doesn't say that. The halacha says that if it's exactly a six, you get your money differential back, but you can't void the deal. So again, because we're speaking in the context of the Mishnah, that makes the discussion between Rabbanon and Rav Tarfon a little bit more complicated. And again, we'll sort of touch back on it to understand what the Gemara is telling us, and then I think we'll move on. We're not going to sort of hover over it, because it can get even more complicated. So just to summarize, last week on Daf Nun Amud Aleph, when we were talking in Nun Amud Aleph, we asked the following question: when what we talk about pachos mishtus, that less than a sixth is la'alter, we asked the question, is it literally la'alter? That means that if the deal was queered by less than a sixth, we just move on. Nothing happens. It's as if nothing happened. That slight dip doesn't have an impact. Or do we say that slight impact at least opens you up to the opportunity to go to your friend or to your relative or whoever and say, is this really the right? And if they say no, then you can recover a minute amount. Because remember, less than a six, what are we talking about? We could talk about pennies or whatever it is. But to be exact, the halacha will allow you to collect it. That's really the Gemara's kasha last week that we focused on. So is it right away or is it not right away? So the Gemara, again, goes back and forth and wants to sort of give an example. And the example in the middle of the daf was the Toshima. We'll quickly go over that Toshima again, because that'll lead us into our current discussion. I think that Toshima is... let's see, it's about 6 lines from the bottom. Okay, so the Gemara wants to resolve the question that we just asked, whether or not is in other words, what can you do with this shtus as far as review? Says the Gemara, you know how we're going to prove it? We're going to prove it from the words of the Mishnah, because remember the Mishnah said that everybody held like the Chachamim. As far as the shtus is concerned, came Rav Tarfon with his chidush that it's a third, not a sixth, and all of a sudden, all of the merchants got very excited and they wanted to follow Rav Tarfon's shita of a third, shtus being a third, not a sixth, because that opened the door to a lot more recovery from the merchants. So the merchants were excited, not the people who would have been defrauded, but the merchants, because for them, the differential between a sixth and a third is recoverable, whereas according to the Chachamim, it's not. So they were very happy with his words. But then Rab Tarfon came and said, "Oh, by the way, yes, I stand by what I said, but also the amount of recovery time is a day, a full day, not just a couple of hours or whatever." Then they chilled and they weren't so happy with him. And the Mishnah says, "Chazru l'divrei chachamim." Says this Toshma, the fact that it says Chazru l'divrei chachamim, that they returned to the words of the Rabbanon about a sixth, not a third, but a sixth. Why? Says so now what is the proof? Savru pachas mishlush Rab Tarfon, kepachas mishlush the Rabbanon dami. We are now, at this point, it'll change, but we're under the impression that there is a parallel between less than a sixth and less than a third. Just like less than a sixth, according to the rabbis, it's insignificant. So too, less than a third is insignificant according to Rav Tarfon. Now, if you hold that, and that's just now temporary, but if you hold that, I amrit bishloma, if you will say pachas mishtus l'Rabbanon, that pachas mishtus l'Rabbanon, what do you do? Bichtei she'yir l'tager or l'krovo, that it doesn't happen right away. You still have the opportunity of going. In other words, you don't forfeit it the minute it happens. You go to your neighborhood friend or your korov, and you ask them, is this a fair number? In other words, if you say that that's what it is, then we understand, okay, fine. Rav Tarfon kol hayom, and Rav Tarfon has the whole day to do the same thing. Okay, mishum hacha chazru. Now we understand why the Mishnah says they returned, because again, comparing apples to apples, less than a third is the same as less than a sixth, and less than a sixth, the rabbis say you have that small window, whatever it is, a half hour, to go to your friend or your relative, and Reb Tarfon says mishum hacha, says the whole day. Then we understand why the Mishnah says mishum hacha chazru. You know why they returned to the Rabbanan? Because it was not advantageous to the mochrim, to the sellers, to support Rav Tarfon's view, because Rav Tarfon opened the door to a buyer having an inordinate amount of time to recant, and that was against what the merchants wanted. They wanted the least amount of time to recant a deal, and they were. But why did they like Rav Tarfon? They liked Rav Tarfon because between 1/6 and a third, Rav Tarfon said it's wholly collectible. It's all considered to be chasru. It's all considered to be less. In other words, between a sixth and a third, according to the rabbis, was already more than shtus, and according to the Rav Tarfon, it wasn't. So they said, wonderful, we have all of this leeway between a sixth and a third to be able to collect. But when Rav Tarfon said, yes, you do, but they have to wait a whole day, they soured on Rav Tarfon. They said, but Rav Tarfon, you're not giving us anything, right? So now we understand Mishum Hacha Chazru, why they returned to the rabbis' view, because even though the rabbis, according to the rabbis, between a sixth and a third was not advantageous, but they reasoned that that's not going to happen that much. In other words, between a sixth and a third, you're not going to have that many cases of overcharge. So if the charges are going to be on lower amounts, we'd rather give them a limited time on the lower amounts and recapture that than open the door to higher amounts and more time, right? That's a balance. You have to balance it. If the proportionate number of deals that went bad were in the lower monetary category, then it's much more advantageous to follow the Rabbanan who give you a limited window. If a lot of, in other words, yeah, Rav Tarfon gives you a better break between a sixth and a third, but how often is that going to happen when you have a whole day to recant? Then they'll ponder, then they'll think about it, they'll talk to people, and they say, you know what, we recant, we don't want that deal. So now it's understandable what the Mishnah says, Mishum Hachu Chazru, right? Okay, but Ella I Amrit, but if you say that Pachas Mishnus L'Rabbanan La'alta have a mechila, but if you take the position that less than a sixth, according to the rabbis, is right away, meaning forget about it, you lost it. There is no window, there's no opportunity to talk to anybody, you lose it right away. If you're going to say that that's the interpretation of Pachas Mishnus La'alta have a mechila, and now Nurma Beis, Ula Rav Tarfon nami la'alta have a mechila, and Rav Tarfon, since he's parallel to the rabbis, will say the same thing, and he would say la'alta have a mechila, that the mechila is right away. Then it's a good kasha. Amai chazru. Why did the merchants abandon Rav Tarfon and go back to the rabbis? What was it about the rabbis that was more advantageous? Verkehrt, but Rav Tarfon nichale tvei. It was better for the merchants under Rav Tarfon's situation with a third. Why? The Madrabanan Kamashvale, I know, because what the rabbis would consider, I know, meaning between a sixth and a third is I know. Rav Tarfon have a mechila. According to Rav Tarfon, that's totally mechila, because everything up to a third is considered de minimis. So then, if you say la'alter right away, meaning there is no room for the possibility of recanting, then certainly Reb Tarfon is better. The only reason why Reb Tarfon was abandoned was because he gave them a full day. But if you're going to say that a sixth to the rabbis is the same as a third to Reb Tarfon, and anything less than shtus is totally non-recoverable, you don't even have a window, then the Mishnah doesn't make sense. Why did they abandon Reb Tarfon? Reb Tarfon is the better source. So this is kind of like, I made this comparison a number of times in the past. You want a psak, and if I go to Rabbi A, yeah, he's going to give me a little bit of a difficult psak, but Rabbi B, he's more makel. I'd rather go to him. So fine. And we call that in a halacha forum shopping. Okay, you go to whatever psak. I mean, it is a good psak, but it's a more lenient psak. That's what's happening here. If you can go to one psak that gives you the money, and you go to another psak that doesn't give you the money, of course you're going to go to that psak. So the Gemara's kasha is a good kasha. Why did they abandon Reb Tarfon? Under this scenario, Reb Tarfon was the better alternative. Right? So that's really the Gemara's kasha here, why the Gemara is going back and forth. Let's take a quick look at Rashi, if that helps us at all. Rashi can elucidate and tell us that, all right, so the Rashi on top, again, according to Reb Tarfon, it's pachos mishlish. Amai chazru. Why did they abandon Rav Tarfon? Kol hayon Rav Tarfon mishlish hu dekamale v'yizharu ma'ono shlish v'hakol mechila alter. According to Rav Tarfon, they have this wide open window to be able to say mechila la'alter for anything under a third. Whereas according to the rabbis, it's a sixth, and between a sixth and a third, you can recant. So it's a no-brainer that they would go with Rav Tarfon. That's the Gemara's puzzlement. Again, so clearly
I think a key here,
yeah,
because in theory we were saying last week, I'm pretty sure that this will go both directions. Well, let's say using a sixth, that if it turned out that the merchant overcharged by a sixth, then they could force it to take it back. Similarly, that if it turns out the merchant undercharged by a sixth because the buyer negotiated too good a deal, that the merchant could take it back.
right.
And the key here is probably in my mind, why we would say that the merchants really want it to be a third is the merchants in theory really know their stuff much more than the average
Correct.
customer. And therefore it's more likely that a merchant's going to end up selling it at between a sixth and a third, then that a buyer would actually get away with with it being discounted more than a sixth. So the
Right.
merchants are
It's an
unlikely to
imbalance.
be
Yeah, it's
caught in that.
imbalance. Right. 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 So economy. So your point. What do you want to make? You want to make the point that that's the reason
That's why the
why
merchants would want that, because in theory,
of
everybody should
course.
be happy with a level playing ground. But in reality, it's not a level playing ground.
Right.
And so therefore the merchants could take a little more advantage if it's a higher amount.
Right. Right. So with this question in mind, the Gemara now is going to change the equation, because remember, till now we said the following: less than a sixth and less than a third are the same. A sixth and a third exactly are the same, and more than a sixth, more than a third are the same. In other words, the categories, while they're different in terms of the fraction, are the same result. They're exactly the same. Less than a sixth is mechila, more than a sixth is total revocation on both sides. And according to the Mishnah, exactly a shtus, whether it's a third or a sixth, is optional to the defrauded party. They can either recant the whole deal. The non-defrauded party cannot recant, but the defrauded party can recant, or you can say, I want the deal, just give me my differential. That's what we were assuming till now. Now the Gemara is going to change the equation. So what does the Gemara say? Mi savris pochas mishlish tarfin. Are you going to say that less than in other words, between a sixth and a third, but less than a third, according to Rab Tarfin, kapachas mishtus, the Rabbanan Dami, is exactly the same as less than a sixth to the rabbis, which means what? That there is mechila, right? A third, less than a third, less than a sixth, totally equal. You think that? That's the premise we've been working on. Says the Gemara, lo. No, that's the wrong premise. Mishtus v'atzlish Rab Tarfin. So this is a chiddush, from a shtus meaning a sixth, to a third. That window to Rab Tarfin, kishtus atzma l'Rabbanan. That's compared to a shtus to the rabbis. Now we've totally leveled the playing field, because if we're going to say that between a sixth and a third is no longer a mechila, a throwaway, it's now the same as shtus. What is the halacha by shtus according to the Mishnah? The defrauded party has a choice to recant the whole deal or get his money back. If you're going to say that in Reb Tarfon, a sixth to a third is the same, now it's a whole different situation. Now we understand why the merchants abandoned Reb Tarfon. The whole advantage they had with Reb Tarfon is they said, oh my gosh, Reb Tarfon gives us this window to collect the money between a sixth and a third, which the rabbis wouldn't give us. But if between a sixth and a third to Reb Tarfon is the same as a sixth to the rabbis, what's the advantage of Reb Tarfon? There's no advantage to Reb Tarfon's view anymore. The whole Metzias, the whole advantage has just dissipated. So now we understand why the Mishnah says Chazur l'Rabbanan. They went back to the rabbis, because at least according to the rabbis, the window was what? Asking a friend. And according to Reb Tarfon, it was a whole day. So if everything was equal now, which it is, according to this view, except that Reb Tarfon gives them a day and the rabbis give them a small window, who would the merchants go with? 100% they go with the rabbis. That's the pshat in Chazul Rabbanan. They went back to the rabbis' view because the rabbis gave them a better chance of success. This is all gesund to gesund, Jay. This is all about what's my best chance of making the deal and keeping the deal alive. According to the merchants, that is in the rabbi's view with a sixth, not with Reb Tarfon and a third. Because Reb Tarfon's grandiose gesture has just been blown up, because he doesn't say that between a sixth and a third yichapit. It's the same as shtus to the rabbis, and then the only difference is that Reb Tarfon says you have a day to recant, and rabbis say no. So okay, so again, we see this time and time again. We were at a crossroads. We didn't understand what the Mishnah meant by Chazru l'Rabbanan under the previous scenario. So the Gemara now, the Amoraim sitting around said, what we said till now isn't correct, because if what we're saying is correct, then there's no reason for them to abandon Reb Tarfon. So this is Pshat Shakla V'Tarya. Okay, we go down the path, we think we've reached a resolution, fine. Wait a minute, how can you reach a resolution? It doesn't fit with what the Mishnah said, Chazur Rabbana. So we undo the resolution, and now we go back and we say, you know what? There's a slight difference that Reb Tarfon and the rabbis aren't parallel on the words pachas mishtus. What one means, pachas mishtus, is not what the other one means. And if you change the definition of pachas mishtus, then we understand that the rabbis were more advantageous to the merchants. Again, that's the beauty of so that's where we are now. We understand the Gemara, we understand the Mishnah, and we understand that the machlokes between Reb Tarfon and the rabbis is not exactly parallel on the definition of every category. Michael.
So why does it matter that Reb Tarfon said a third? Essentially, it could be 80%. So you have the right to undo beyond a sixth under that perspective. So what does he say after a third? So he says between a sixth and a third, you have the right for the differential, or you can undo the deal. What about above a third?
Above a third, it's voidable by both parties.
Okay, so the difference is that between there, it's voidable only by the aggrieved party.
Correct.
The other party has no
standing to undo anything because he has not been aggrieved. So if the kernel of your question, and I'm not sure if it is, if the kernel of your question is how did Reb Tarfon get to a third in the first place, if that's what the question is as opposed to a sixth, I have to assume that based on the buying and selling in the marketplace, they took from that. They didn't make it up. They took from what they saw in the marketplace that people weren't makbid on a sixth. In other words, it's not that the rabbis imposed, we're going to say a sixth and we're going to say a third. They saw that in the marketplace, according to the rabbi's view, a sixth was not significant. And according to Reb Tarfon, a third was not significant. In other words, they took their lead from the actual customers, from the buyers and the sellers. What bothers you? At what point are you going to reject the deal because you've been defrauded? So according to in Reb Tarfon's view, it's a third. In the rabbi's view, it's a sixth. And we thought up till now that, you know what, it was semantics, but everything else was the same. The structure of the rabbis and the structure of Reb Tarfon as to when you can be Michael or not was the same, but you insert a third versus a sixth. Gemara is telling us, no, that's not the case. There is not a similar structure between them. Rav Tarfon's third is not the same as the rabbi's sixth, because according to Rav Tarfon, the third is equivalent not to less than a sixth, but to an exact sixth. If it's compared to an exact sixth, then the halacha is different between an exact sixth and less than a sixth. Less than a sixth is a throwaway. An exact sixth is, like we just said, the defrauded party can make that choice which way he wants. And if you say that Reb Tarfon's third is now that view, that changes the whole equation, and Reb Tarfon is no longer the hero of the merchants because he who giveth taketh away.
But Rabbi, I agree with exactly what you said, but what I don't understand, under the rabbi's position, above a sixth, either party can undo the deal.
Just like above a third.
So what I don't understand is, from a practical standpoint, if let's say it's the buyer that's aggrieved, and the buyer contests it above a sixth, the seller can void the deal saying, I don't want to bother with this. You either buy it or don't. It's right. The same thing with a third. If it's between a sixth and a third, you're going to bother with this. I'm sorry, between a sixth and a third, you're aggrieved. So only the aggrieved can reverse the deal. You have to endure the day, and you may not make the sale. That's the essence of what the problem.
Correct. Yeah, that summarizes it well. So that's where we are right now in the Gemara, and we've reconciled what the Mishnah says, Chazur l'Rabbanan, because the Rab Tarfon's deal wasn't what was cracked up to be. Right. Now, so now, having said that, in typical fashion, now the Gemara is going to ask the next question. If that's your explanation, what was the joy in the first place in Reb Tarfon? You know, once you make the change and you understand why they went back to the rabbis, the next question is, so what was it about Reb Tarfon that they even liked in the first place? I mean, before we said what it was because he gave them the break. Right, because he gave them the break between a sixth and a third. But if there's no break between a sixth and a third, because the difference between a sixth and a third is the same as a sixth according to the rabbis, and in either of those cases, the aggrieved party can back out or not, then what was the havamina of why they were happy with Reb Tarfon? What is it that Reb Tarfon said in the beginning that made them happy, for which he later recanted? It's kind of like when we go through a series of questions and answers, and then we give a good answer, then we scratch our head. So what was the question in the first place? The answer is so good that what was the question? Why were they happy in the first place? There should have been no reason for them to be happy with Reb Tarfon based on this explanation. Again, this is so, it's wonderful because this is how the Gemara again and again makes us think, all right, we're now happy because we got a good answer. But if we got a good answer, what was the havamina? What was the havamina, right? And by the way, there are meforshim all over the Torah who always start with this question, especially with Rashi and other things. So what was the Gemara's havamina? What did Rashi even have in mind? If we now know an answer and the answer is so good, what was the question? Why was there a question? Again, I'm just pointing it out because that is so perfectly symmetrical to how the Gemara makes us think. So now this is a good question. What was the whole beauty of Reb Tarfon that they were happy about? Right? So the Gemara extracts now that because there was a happiness in the beginning, this gives us at least a segment of proof that according to the Rabbanan, where if you can avoid the wholesale, then that voidance is la'olam. It's a new concept now. If we're going to say that there was a havamina of rejoicing to Rav Tarfon, we have to understand why they rejoiced for Rav Tarfon against the rabbis. It must be because the rabbis had an open-ended policy of what? Of avoidance. In other words, I'm talking about like more than a shtus. If it was more than a shtus, the question is, how much time do you have with more than a shtus? Do you have a day? Do you have an hour? The Gemara is extracting from here, it must be, according to the rabbis, you have an unlimited amount of time, because if you didn't have an unlimited amount of time, why would there be, why are they happy according to Reb Tarfon? What does Reb Tarfon give them that the rabbis don't? It must be that according to Reb Tarfon, you have a window of a day, and according to the rabbis, we're flipping the switch, you have an unlimited window. Now we understand the hava amina of why they went with Reb Tarfon. Do you see how we're going a whole 180 degrees? We're flipping the switch, and we're saying, if we just concluded that we understand the machlokes between Reb Tarfon and the rabbis, then what was the hava amina? Why were they happy with Reb Tarfon if the rabbis give them a better deal? You know why they were happy with Reb Tarfon? Because on the other end, on more than a shtus, meaning more than a sixth, the rabbis say you have an unlimited of time to recant, and the Reb Tarfon says, no, you don't, you only have a day. Then the merchant said, no brainer, we have to go with Reb Tarfon, because according to the rabbis, we'll never, ever have a deal. According to the rabbis, he can wake up a week later and say, I didn't like the deal, undo the deal. Reb Tarfon says, no, you have 1 day. Do you understand? So now we've gone the completely other direction, and we understand, according to what the Gemara is now telling us, why there was a havamina to rejoice with Reb Tarfon, because at least Reb Tarfon, in the case of Yosem Mishtus, gave them a limited time of a day. The rabbis gave him an open-ended parsha. Yeah, Michael.
So there's got to be a reason that they turn back to the rabbis, because
and we're gonna get to that in a minute, right? But we're first starting to unfurl the story of if it's such a good deal with the rabbis, what was the have a minute to go with Reb Tarfon? So we're starting from scratch again. We're saying, you know why they went with Reb Tarfon? Because Reb Tarfon said a day, and the rabbis said unlimited. And now let's look like in the Gemara. Now we're going to see why they recanted again and went back to the rabbis. That's exactly what the Gemara is going to tell us. All right, so the kiven the Amalu Rab Tarfon Hava I know because since the rabbi said that from a sheish from a sixth to a shlish to a third, there is price fraud, right? There is fraud because they now. Remember, we changed the definition of fraud according to Reb Tarfon, and we said that from a sixth to a third was like a shtus to the rabbis. Okay, so now that wasn't so great, but Reb Tarfon said you only have a day to do it. Samchu. Then okay, so Samchu, they were happy. Why? Because they said, okay, even though between a sixth and a third there is fraud, we understand it. But samchu ki amar kol hayom, because when he said to them, "You can," but only a day, then they were happy because according to the rabbis, it's open-ended. So the Gemara is speaking out here the actual svara to tell us why they were happy with Reb Tarfon, because Reb Tarfon was telling them, yeah, it can be fraud, and you have a day. And they're saying to themselves, a day, that's a luxury. The rabbis say unlimited, right? So then, so Chazru, so then afterwards, they came back and they said, according to the rabbis, why? The Isol Kedatach. Because if you think the Bittel Mekach L'Rabbanan B'chtei Shiur L'Hago L'Krovo, because if you will say that the measuring stick for retracting is what the rabbis say, that it's for the time that he needs to show them what it is, then b'mai samchu. So then the kasha is again, why did the merchants then rejoice and say, no, we're abandoning that position according to between a sheish, between a sixth and a third, Reb Tarfon was the one who said that the lokeach is in better shape, right? But if we're going to say that Reb Tarfon and the Chachamim say that there is a very limited time for making a demand, then there's no benefit to Reb Tarfon's system. So what we're left here with the question is that if we see that we go with the rabbis where they say that it is an unlimited amount of time, then we understand why they rejoiced with Reb Tarfon. But once Reb Tarfon clarified, and he said that, you know what, if you're going to go between a sixth and a third, then I'm going to give you no. Oh, so if Rav Tarfon will agree, okay, this is a shot. So if Rav Tarfon is going to agree that between a sixth and a third, he'll agree to what the rabbi said, that there will be an unlimited of time to collect, then again the rabbis are better than Rav Tarfon because they're both saying you have an unlimited amount of time, but the rabbis hold the line by a shtus, and Rav Tarfon says that no, it's up to a third. So then the amount of time that passes is the same for both. It's the amount that you're going to be able to argue. Then they were chazur to the Rabbanan, because if they saw in Reb Tarfon that Reb Tarfon was the same as the rabbis in terms of the unlimited amount of time that you can have, why should they go with Reb Tarfon? They'd rather go with the rabbis where there was a greater chance, because the principle is that most and this is the Rashi, the Gemara had said it before, most deals that go bad on the lower end of the selling spectrum, not on the higher end of the spectrum. In other words, more deals are made between, let's say, a sixth and a little bit more, a little bit less, rather than a third. That what Reb Tarfon says a third, those are bigger deals, and they happen less frequently. So the Gemara is telling us if everything is equal, and Reb Tarfon and the rabbis both say there's an unlimited amount of time, where am I better off? I'm better off with the smaller deals, which are more frequent, and there may be a greater likelihood of a deal going through than with the bigger deals, where because of the additional time, the bigger deals will be more scrutinized and then perhaps wiped out. So again, now we understand, he's trying to give us to understand why they went with Reb Tarfon and why they recanted from Reb Tarfon back to the rabbis. Because if everything is equal, the rabbis still give them a better chance of making $1, the merchants I'm talking about, than Reb Tarfon. Because according to Reb Tarfon, if it's unlimited, people will wake up and say, this isn't a good deal. And especially when they're losing more money, because a third is more money than a sixth. But if it's only a sixth, okay, so those deals will squeak by with more frequency. And the Gemara is telling us that it's the frequency of the deals that make the merchants happy or not. So if they can make more deals, albeit less money, because it's only a sixth, they'll go with it. Yeah, Michael.
Rabbi, there's a pragmatic aspect to this.
Yeah.
So we're talking about produce, not that it's exclusively produce, but let's say we're talking about produce.
Yeah.
It has a shelf life, most of it for freshness, very short. If it has to dry out or something,
Right.
it's worth less.
Right.
So pragmatically, you can't reverse the deal. You could make the differential be paid back. But how do you, in those times too, how could you go back and say, well, it was this quality or not this quality, and this was the time or not? They didn't chronicle all the pricing at that point in time. So in the interest of business, how did you give them unlimited time to be able to go back and undo the transaction?
That is a very good question, because if you're dealing with agriculture, then time is a major factor. It's interesting, the Gemara does not, and Rashi doesn't even comment on that point of it, because you would think that in an agrarian society where these cases come up most of the time, then there should be a window. So this teaches us something, Michael, that if we were in business together and I defrauded you because I sold something to you well above what it should be, then l'chayra, even if the produce is already not usable because it decayed and is now not usable, I can still come back to you and say you defrauded me, and therefore I should be able to get my money back even if I can't use the produce anymore because you defrauded me. In other words, the defraud supersedes the lifespan of. It's a good question, because
but Rabbi, that argues for just a differential. So, what is agreed upon. It shouldn't be that you could undo the deal. It should mean that within that range, you can get the differential back, but it's still a deal. So the idea is to go back and pay, for the quote unquote defrauded amount, overpriced amount, is to remunerate, let's say in this case, the buyer for that amount. But to undo the deal, you can't, because it doesn't have a life. You go out 2 weeks, it doesn't have a life. So you're not getting a return. The only thing that should be thought of is reimbursing value, because you have a deal. You can't postpone and undo the deal for something.
Right. The seller, maybe he innocently calculated things a little bit wrong, and it turns out it was a little bit over the sixth, the third, whatever. If the deal gets undone 2 weeks later, he's now out everything, because the produce is affected. Or it might be that it's worth a tiny fraction of what it was originally, but he's got to refund the whole thing. He's going to be in big trouble.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. It's a good question. So in other words, what you're saying is, at the very worst, it should be the differential that keep the deal is the deal, but it's the differential that should be repaid, not avoidance of the deal. Because if it's avoidance of the deal, then the merchant really loses. Whereas
depending on what it is, some things it wouldn't make a difference, but some things would make a huge difference.
Would make a huge difference. So okay, let's contemplate that question, because it is a good question. Let's take a look at Rashi and let's see how Rashi posits all this. So in other words, in this new view, we're saying that between a sixth and a third, according to Rab Tarfon, is like a shtus, like actually a sixth to the rabbis. And there is no machlekes between Rab Tarfon and the Chachamim, el the bittul mekach today, masvele ono, that the bittul mekach, he has to return the money. V'yodo al elyona, and the yodos al elyona. Va'ali b'drabanan shneim chozrim. According to the rabbis in our Mishnah, both can retract. Because remember, we're saying that for an exact sixth, we say in our Mishnah that both can retract, not just the aggrieved party. So the rabbi's situation would be more aggressive than Reb Tarfon's situation for the same amount of the same differential. Frag the Gemara, ihoche de Reb Tarfon aftel mekach l'chudei plig, but my samchu mikara. So that we ask the question, what was the havamina of why they were happy if we now know the answer to Reb Tarfon, right? So we say tifshot samchu bitul mekach l'rabanan de meboil l'kaman, because of the kasha that we ask, ila olam choser, can you just completely retract? Or b'chtei sheyira tifshot the mesamch l'rabanan l'olam choser. So so now we're positing that according to the rabbis, you have an unlimited of time to retract. And when Rab Tarfon says "Ona," they were under the impression, okay, so now at least according to Rab Tarfon, we have a limited amount of time. According to the rabbis, it's unlimited. So now the samchu for Rab Tarfon was because he gave the merchants a better chance of recovering than the rabbis. So says the Gemara, Ki amalahu kol hayom chazru. They have a whole day. Chada debein la'olam chozer ben shos kol hayom hano purta. In other words, the differential of a day is de minimis. Hila the day, he holds to his position. To show us harbe yesh limloch kol hayom, that va'od onor yeser al shtus, and the onor is more than a sixth. Lo shchicha, it's not usual. In other words, again, now we're going to which scenario is more likely, there to be a bad deal of a higher number or of a lower number. So then the rabbis say, okay, we're going to give them only a day. We're going to give them a day, and according to Reb Tarfon, and the rabbis are going to say, no, you have a smaller window. You have a smaller window. So, okay, so the Isol Kadatach, let's see, is this Rashi on what we just said? Tifshet to bittel mekach l'rabbanan la'olam chazer. Kolayam chazer. The Isol Kadatach, the bittel mekach l'rabbanan. Because if you have a havamina that there was bittul mekach b'chtei sheyira l'tager l'krova b'mai samchu. Okay, so all right, so now we're at this point in time still questioning why the merchants were rejoicing, since according to Rab Tarfon, you have a day and according to the rabbis, he's changing his view and saying the bittul mekach l'manan b'kidei shiyir l'tager l'krovo, to have enough time to show it to his relative or friend. So then the question became again, why did the merchants, why did they rejoice back to the rabbis? If according to Reb Tarfon, no, why did they even have the havamina of rejoicing according to Reb Tarfon if they had a better deal with the rabbis? Again, the thread here is a little bit complicated. Okay, so all right, let's just the next line changes the scenario again. So let's just take one step further. So the Gemara now says, since there is no benefit to Reb Tarfon, why did they have a havamina of rejoicing, of being mesamech with Reb Tarfon over the rabbis? So take a look at just the next line. And for the Gemara, somchu b'shtus atzma, that the machlokes is with a sixth itself, which shtus, not more, not less. Why? The Reb Tarfon mechila, because according to Reb Tarfon, now we're changing the definition again. According to Reb Tarfon, when there was on shtus itself, Reb Tarfon says mechila, there is no chance of undoing the deal. That's why they were happy with Reb Tarfon, because he defines shtus as mechila, meaning less than a sixth. Well, the Rabbanon, I know, but according to the Rabbanon, exactly a shtus is I know, and he can cancel the deal. The Gemara, that's why they were mesameach with Reb Tarfon, because the merchants had a better chance of recovering with Reb Tarfon than they did with the rabbis, because according to Reb Tarfon, what we're saying, shtus means meaning less than the required amount, which is mechila right away, right? So now we're flipping the switch again. We're redefining what shtus is. According to the Reb Tarfon, shtus means less than a sixth, and according to Rabbanan, it means a sixth. So if the Rabbanan say it's a sixth, you can undo the deal potentially. If according to Reb Tarfon it's less than a sixth, you can't undo the deal. So again, that's why the Gemara it tells us, why the Mishnah said they were rejoicing to Reb Tarfon, because Reb Tarfon defined shtus differently. Before we said that there was we changed in the beginning of this discussion this morning. We just said that the Reb Tarfon changed the definition of a shtus to mean that shtus of a third is like the rabbi's shtus of a sixth. Now he's going further and he's saying, you know what? According to Reb Tarfon, shtus means less than a third, or meaning less than a third, means there's mechila. He's even going to a bigger extreme. There's now mechila. Whereas according to the rabbi, shtus means a sixth, and there is the opportunity, according to the Mishnah, to either undo or to get your differential. According to Reb Tarfon, you can do nothing because a shtus means mechila. So again,
Rabbi, does that mean that he can get the differential back but can't undo the deal, or nothing happens?
According to Reb Tarfon, nothing happens.
Well, that's what we thought in the first place, that if it was under
well, let's think a minute. In the beginning, we thought that less than a third is mechila, but how about a third itself? A third itself, according to Reb Tarfon, was never mechila. It was optional of undoing or voiding. Now we're defining a third as mechila. We're tipping the equation here, and we're saying that according to Reb Tarfon, when we say a third, that's mechila. You can't even have a havamina of getting your differential back.
But that I could have sworn we thought that when it was the first Havamina when it was the rabbis versus Rab Tarfon.
No,
There
no,
was
we
no differential between a sixth and a third
if
until that.
so we said, yeah, so we said if it's less than a third or a sixth, it's mechila. If it's exact, then but now we're saying that not less than a third itself is mechila.
Right.
We're taking another aggressive step in Reb Tarfon, and we're saying not only is less than a third mechila, a third itself is mechila. Whereas before we thought a third itself was either undoing or avoidance. Now we're saying no. According to Reb Tarfon, that's why they rejoiced with Reb Tarfon, because he went off to the extreme and said if it's a third, it's mechila.
So
So
how does it change now? And does he still feel that way? Because if he does, then it is a huge difference because he's saying that you've got to a third. It gives them more wiggle room. If I understand this correctly, a sixth has no impact according to Rab Tarfon,
that's
except
right.
except that he gives them a day to undo the deal. So why wouldn't they go to Rab Tarfon? Because according to the rabbis, they have unlimited time and it's a sixth. And a sixth itself is the right to avoid the deal. So why is Rab Tarfon not preferable?
So say it. So why is the sixth itself what?
So if I understood the new twist, let's call it, that Rab Tarfon believes that anything less than a third is Michael. Nothing happens. So
But
he
no,
doesn't
no,
get a
no.
difference.
Even a third is Michael. In this
Okay.
new,
But
even
I'm
a
saying a
third is
third
Michael.
or less is Michael.
Third or less,
So
yes.
they get the benefit of that the differential of a third or less. Anything over a third, it sounds like, according to Rab Tarfon, in this interpretation, they have the right to either the differential or to void the deal.
Right.
According to the Rabbeim, they have a sixth itself, and above they have the right to void the deal or get the differential back.
Right. So
So
so so
so why
where
wouldn't
would
you
the
go with
merchants be
Rav
happier?
Tarfon with the same amount of time? Rav Tarfon says one day, they say forever. So even
Right.
if Rav Tarfon said forever, then why wouldn't you go with a third or sixth under the same terms?
But that's why they were happy with Rav Tarfon. We're
Right.
trying to justify why there was a happiness with Rav Tarfon in the first place.
Right, and that would be, but we keep changing the definition, so
That's
it
right.
must be that it changed from that again. So
So, Michael, we're changing the definition to fit into the understanding of why the Tagra de Reb Tarfon, why the merchants of Reb Tarfon were so happy with Reb Tarfon.
well,
We've got to find a
that's what
way.
we thought in the first place is that he gave him up to a third. Not there was nothing between a sixth and a third.
Right.
We thought that. Then they went around and said the sixth and the third is the same as the rabbi's sixth. Now
Right.
we're saying again that a third is different than a sixth.
He's being even more aggressive and saying that a
And saying
third
even a third itself
is
is
Mechila.
right.
Right. Mechila.
So
Right.
I assume there's another spin to this because they have to go back to the rabbis.
Exactly right. Right. So let to be TBD. So we're going to have to figure out exactly how that's going to work. But right now, where we stand is that the Gemara turned it around to be able to understand why, there was a Havamina of in Rav Tarfon, why the Tagrid of Rav Tarfon had a Havamina that they would want to go with him. So that's what we're saying right now. Okay, good. So let's put that on pause, and then let's go one step further. Again, I would like to sort of move forward so we can finish this because it's a very complicated back and forth. So now the Gemara is going to ask another kasha. So I'll put the question we just set aside. So now the Gemara we're gonna investigate and take a look what it means la'olam chayzer, because that's going to impact what we just said. So iboy lahu, the Gemara asks Akasha, bitl mekach l'rabbanan. In the case of bitl mekach, which means more than a shtus according to the Rabbanan, is bitl mekach is total voiding the contract. La'olam chayzer. Is it la'olam? He has forever to retract. In other words, he can sit on his haunches for 6 months and then come back and say no deal. Odilma b'chdei she'ira l'tago l'krovo. Or no, he has the right to retract, but it's only in the window of going to consult with his relative or friend. That's the Gemara's kasha. We're going to see how this folds back, Michael, into the overall question. But now that's the Gemara's kasha. So now the Gemara is going to go with a havamina. Im timtza lomar. If you're going to say that the standard is b'chdei she'yir l'taga l'krovo, that the amount of time that he has to undo the deal is only the amount of time that it takes to show it to someone else and get an opinion. My ika ben shtus liyeser al shtus. Then what difference is there between exact shtus and yesher al shtus? Because yesher al shtus, we say, is complete avoidance. Shtus itself is either avoidance or differential. Then what's the difference? If you're going to give him a limited window, then how do you define shtus or yeser than shtus? Says the Gemara, Ika, there is a difference. Why? The ilu shtus, for it's exactly a shtus, then mishin is ana choizer. Then only one party can retract, either lokeach or the mocher, whoever's been defrauded. The yeser al shtus, but more than shtus, in other words, if you're going to have a havamina that there is a difference, because with exact shtus only one party can retract, but if it's more than shtus, right, shneim choizrim, then both can retract. So he says, what's the halacha? Notice the Gemara's kasha is, how are we going to understand this unlimited window of retraction? So so this is the Gemara's kasha. Do we say that it's only limited to the time that you have to retract, in which case the kasha is, what's the difference? So I'll tell you, there is a difference, because in one case only one person can retract, and in another case both can retract. So what is the halacha? Right? That's the kasha. That's the Gemara's kasha. Says the Gemara, Toshma. Okay, we're going to try to give an answer to this kasha, and then maybe with that, Michael, we're going to go back to our original source. So what's the Toshma? Chazru l'divrei chachamim. Okay, here we go. In the Mishnah, it says that they held like Rab Tarfon, but then they went back to the words of the chachamim. All right, that's where we left it off a moment ago. I amrit bishloma bitl mekach l'rabanon. If you're going to tell me, bitl mekach the rabbanon, that where the rabbis void the deal, right? Then b'chdei she'yir l'tago l'krova, where the rabbis say that the deal is voided, you only have the limited time of going to a friend. U'l'Rab Tarfon kol hayom, and according to Rab Tarfon, you have a whole day. Then the Mishnah makes sense why they went back to the rabbis, because the rabbis in the same situation had a smaller window of retraction. That's why the merchants were happy. But if you're going to say that the rabbis hold that bitl mekach, that once you're mavatal the mekach, then you have forever to retract, amai chazru. Why should they go back from Rab Tarfon to the rabbis? B'divrei Rab Tarfon nichalei tfei. Then they're better off with Rab Tarfon, because Rab Tarfon says komashvele oino kolayom, that the oino is only for a day, right? V'sulo, but not more than a day. Whereas according to the rabbis, if you're going to take this view that bitl mekach is la'olam, is like forever, a day, a week, a month, then what was the happiness in going back to the rabbis? The rabbis gave them, to the merchants, gave them a much worse system than Rab Tarfon, who said, fine, okay, it's price fraud, but you have a day, and the likelihood is either they'll do it or not do it, but beyond a day, they can't challenge you anymore. It's too low, and not longer than a day, right? So l'chayra, having said this, now, okay, so it's back to the question of why did they go back to the rabbis? In other words, why were they misameach with the rabbis? Rab Tarfon's system is better. So he's slugging up now. The Gemara is asking this kasha as to whether or not, based on the question of whether or not you have forever, or I mean, unlimited amount of time, it would seem to be that it makes no sense when the Mishnah says that they abandoned Reb Tarfon and went to the rabbis. Why abandon Reb Tarfon when Reb Tarfon gave the merchants a better chance a day to undo, rather than the rabbis who gave them la'olam, who gave them an unlimited amount of time? So that's the Gemara's kasha. So the Gemara comes back with a final answer, and this is we was hoping to get to, is that bittul mekach lo shchiach. This is a whole new concept, gentlemen, that bittul mekach, the concept of voiding the deal itself, they're saying in reality, lo shchiach didn't happen often. In other words, when a deal was struck, the deal somehow survived, even with scotch tape and pushing and changing and ma'isa, but no one wanted to void the whole deal. So the Gemara is telling us that in those times when people came together and made a deal, they really made the deal because they wanted to find a way to make the deal happen, even if it means pushing and shoving over the finish line. So this concept of lo shchiach changes the way we think about the whole Gemara, because we thought, no big deal, they'll void the deal, and you know what? There may not have been enough merchants to sell food, that if they found a merchant to sell the food and there was a quarrel over price, let's fix the quarrel and make the deal as opposed to not. Why is this important? Because the concept of unlimited time to undo is no longer even shchiach, because no one's going to want to undo the deal. Everybody wants to make a deal, and let's just figure it out. In other words, this is, by the way, the ultimate way of making compromise, is by saying you can't undo the deal. Sit together, work it out, compromise. And that's how the Gemara is giving us a lesson, a very important lesson, is that compromise is the way to go. Go ahead, Michael. I know
Rabbi, that's the same as just saying, if there's a differential, either work it out or somebody will judge that. You can't undo the deal.
Right.
De facto, that's what you're saying. There's not two options. You have to work out the differential.
Right. So if you start with the premise that the deal is never going to get undone, now sit together and work it out. That means there has to be compromise. There can't be, oh, I don't like the deal, I'm walking away. Not shayach. You can't do that anymore. So this is the rabbi's way of saying, forget about it. You are stuck together. You made a deal. Now figure it out and make it work.
I still don't understand why they would go back to the Rabbanon, because they're still saying you have more than a day de facto to negotiate this. And Rabbi Tarfon says you only have a day. So why wouldn't you stick?
No. So the reason to go back to the rabbis now, because if the deal has to happen, were they better off, the merchants, with a small window or a big window? Rabbi Tarfon gives them a day, right? And oh, you're saying, but if you have to stick with the deal, what's the pshat in Rav Tarfon? I guess the answer. So now we have to flip the answer and say that when Rav Tarfon says he gives them a day, he gives them a day to resolve the problem, whereas the rabbis only give them a small window to resolve the problem. No one says you can walk away from the deal. It's how much time you have to resolve the problem.
Okay. So you're saying they have to, it's got to be an hour or two, they have to resolve the deal.
Exactly. So this is how the Gemara comes back and compromises and says, sure, they were happier with the rabbis, not because you could undo the deal, because there's a smaller window to reach an agreement, as opposed to Rav Tarfon, where he gave them a whole day. Either way, the deal will get done. So this is a very interesting way of coming back and resolving the whole issue. So at least we've reached some conclusion here, because otherwise we could have gone around and around forever. So let's just do a couple more Rashis. And then actually next week, we're going to talk about the actual imprimatur of the halacha, because Rava is going to say, okay, remember this whole discussion that I told you we had, the machlekes between the Mishnah and the halacha, that whereas the Mishnah says you can void the deal or not void the deal, and the halacha says you can only get the differential back, right, by shtus. That's going to be the discussion going forward. So we're really going to reach that point of that discussion. So let's just take a look here in Rashi and see what Rashi has to tell us. Isol Kadata Bittel Mekach L'Rabanan Kishaona Bichdei Sheyira Ve'ein Bein Ono LeBittel Mekach. There's no difference between Ono and Bittel Mekach. Ela Ono Yodo Ala El Yona. By Ono, let's say it's the buyer. He's the one who can dictate terms. Bittel Mekach Shneim Chosrim. Remember, at this point before the conclusion, we said that if it was more than a sixth, either one can avoid the deal. But if it's exactly a sixth, only the defrauded party can void the deal or get his money back. The other fellow is stuck. Then the merchants don't get the benefit of anything with Reb Tarfon. They are misameach b'shtus atzma to armina and mishtus v'atshlish, because from a sixth to a third, the Reb Tarfon kishtus l'rabbanan. That's again in the Havamina, it's like shtus to the rabbis. Mishtus amala amru v'lo shtus atzma. Only shtus and above can you void the deal, but with a sixth you can't void the deal. You can only get your money back. Im tim tzaloma klomer. In Lomer Pshita, the Olam Choser, that if you can always retract the Ibich di Shira, my Ika. What's the difference between Shtus and more than a Shtus? So the Gemara gave us an answer. The Ika, the Ilu Shtus, Kinami Amrin and Travaya, Bichtei Shira, Adan Yesh Chiluk Ze B'neihem. There is a difference because in one you can retract entirely, and in one only one person can retract. So we saw a difference. Mishum Hachi Chazru, that's why they retracted from Reb Tarfon. Mi'ikara ki shavalel Reb Tarfon yeser al shtus oino. Then the Rabbanon bittel mekach below hirchiv zman hachazara samchu b'shtus atzma. They were the mechila la'alter. They in other words, pick your poison. Do you want more time, or do you want a greater opportunity to retract or not? In other words, the sixth to a third is one thing versus time. It's quantity versus the time. So l'chatchila, he said, you know what? I like the fact that that according to Reb Tarfon, between a sixth and a third, we merchants have the benefit. The mechila la'alta can amina b'chihoda amalu kol hayom. But then he came back and said, no, you have a whole day. Then they switched their allegiance because now the time thwarted them from collecting, so they were better off with the smaller amount, because the smaller amount, it was more shchiach, more likely that the merchants would recover. The hichmer lahem, he was machmer beyeser al shtus. Upogam lahem yoser mima sheshvicham b'shtus atzma capricious. Ella, but if you say forever, okay, so let's hold off on this Rashi, because I think we want to start the next sugi before we go over it. So where we are right now is that we have made a determination that in the marketplace, everyone agrees that since shtus, since bittel mekach lo shchiach, in other words, the likelihood of actually voiding a deal is not really likely. It's not common. It's not likely. Therefore, the whole machlokes centers around whether or not how much time there is, and that's why we understand the Mishnah. Originally, we thought Reb Tarfon gave the merchants an advantage, but when he recanted and said, no, they have the whole day, then the whole time issue turned in favor of the rabbis, and that's why Chazru l'Rabbana. So that part of the Mishnah now makes sense why they started with Reb Tarfon and came back to the Rabbanan, because we're basically, of the three categories, we're saying that Mechila la'alter, yeah, that happens. Oino itself, that happens. But Yosemi Oino, but in other words, Jews don't overcharge each other so much that they will say, oh, this deal is I can't accept the deal. Because again, in that society, it was, again, we have to understand it, is that making the deal was more important because they needed the produce. And if they didn't make the deal, they may not have any produce at all. There may not be another merchant around. So they're forced to make the deal. And by forcing you to make the deal, it forces you to the table to negotiate fairly between the parties. So this may be a lesson. Chazal is giving us a lesson for the future, is when we're in business, that, guys come together, you made a deal, the deal is kind of going sideways, don't undo the deal, figure out how to compromise to make the deal happen. That's the imprimatur of what Chazal is telling us, and it's a terrific suggestion, even today in our time, is that this is the way people should do business. Not, oh, you overcharged me, you grossly overcharged me, and therefore I'm walking away. All right, let's find a way to compromise. And by the way, in Bezdin, the whole premise of Bezdin in our time, which is a little controversial, is pshara. It's not din. In other words, the Bezdin today, their aim is pshara, is to make a compromise. Now, compromise means that everybody gives up a little bit. If you're the guy who says, no, I'm 100% right, why should I compromise? Okay, we're gonna have a hard time coming to a deal. But if the whole premise of Bezdin is Bezdin will compromise, so if we are two litigants, we should sit down and hammer out a deal. In other words, when we litigated even in civil in court, the premise to us as lawyers always was, get your clients to reach an agreement. You don't want the court to impose an agreement on you. That's the principle by which our system works. In other words, if I have a client and he's hot under the collar and he's angry, he was defrauded or this or that or the other, so your first charge is to sort of calm him down and to tell him the deal is still in your hands. You can still work out a compromise. Otherwise, the court will, and you may be less happy with the court's compromise than your own. That is the single most basic lesson that a lawyer can give his client, and that comes from this Gemara. Think about it. It comes from what we just learned now, is if push comes to shove, and the deal is going to happen. Just accept it. Now, make the best deal you can. Then your whole mindset's going to be different. You're not going to be belligerent and say, I don't want to make a deal. You're going to say, I want to make a deal. Now, what's the best deal I can make? And that's exactly what this Gemara is teaching us. It's a beautiful concept, but it's right here in the Gemara in Bava Metzia of how we should conduct ourselves in any dispute, let's say, between two people, is that let's accept the premise that we're going to live together and find a way to work it out. I think it's terrific. I think it's terrific. All right. So Mitzvah Shem, next week, we're going to start with Amarava, which will be the actual discussion of the difference between the way the Mishnah accepts the halacha and the halacha. In other words, we're going to roll it back to what we said a few weeks ago, that there's a dispute between the Mishnah and the halacha, and we're going to go into that dispute next week, even though in a sense we're beyond the dispute, because we've already said that the incidence of total vitiating a deal is not likely, but still we need to understand the machlokes, why the Mishnah had a havamina to say that with shtus you either have the choice of voiding or not voiding, whereas the halacha in shtus does not give you the right to void. It only gives you the right to get the differential.
Rabbi.
All right, Yishkoyach, look, it's terrific. Everybody hung in to go through this. This is not an easy Gemara. Going in, this is one of the tougher Gemaras to really follow through. So Yashikoyach to everyone,